This is a 1972 Citroen DS, and it's weird. It's not just weird, it's one of the quirkiest cars of all time, with some absolutely bizarre features that are totally crazy and insane, and some amazing innovations that it pioneered that later swept the car industry. It's also French, which adds to the weird factor, and so today I'm going to review the Citroen DS and show you all of the quirkiest cars, quirks, and features. Before I get started, big news, this Citroen DS is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This has it all, the Frenchness, the quirkiness, of course the famous hydro-pneumatic suspension, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Citroen DS where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, time for the quirks and features of one of the quirkiest cars, the Citroen DS. But before I get into all the many weirdnesses, let me give you a little context to help explain why this car is so iconic and well known and why it's still talked about so much decades after it went out of production. So here's the deal. The DS came out back in 1955 and it was sold through 1975, good old 20-year production run. It was a large sort of nearish luxury sedan. Think about a Mercedes E-Class or a BMW 5 Series, that type of car, but before those cars existed. It wasn't quite on that level of luxury. Maybe it's more of a Toyota Avalon, but that was sort of the segment it occupied back in its day. Now in today's world, we think of French cars as weird and quirky, and they already had that reputation when the DS came out in the 1950s. But this took weird and quirky to an entirely different level than anything the French had done before. Now, the most immediately obvious quirk about the DS is the way it looks, the design, the appearance. Like so many other iconic cars, the DS was designed by an Italian, Flaminio Bertoni, surprisingly unrelated to the Bertoni design house that came later, also from Italy. Interestingly, Bertoni also designed for Citroën the 2CV, which was their other iconic car from this era, and so the two most iconic French cars of all time were actually designed by an Italian. The DS certainly has an unusual look. By today's standards, it kind of looks like just sort of a weird old car, but put into perspective, back in its era, this design would have been nuts. In the 1950s, cars still had big round surfaces and giant curved fenders. American cars had tail fins and chrome and straight lines everywhere. And then this shows up with this teardrop swept back shape that was reportedly inspired by a water droplet or possibly a fish, or maybe both. This would have been a crazy thing to see on the road in the 1950s, where you had a lot of old kind of 40s cars still on the road with a totally old school, different look. This thing moved car design forward completely by a matter of decades. And whether you love or hate the design of the DS, it was certainly a crazy thing for its time. Would have been an unbelievable head-turning spaceship look compared to all the other cars that were on the road back then. But the design wasn't the only thing that made the DS famous. This car came with an enormous amount of innovations, technical ideas, some of which became huge success stories later, adopted by dozens of other automakers, and this car was the first, and some of which were totally insane and bizarre. They were laughed at and never used again. But such is life when you're trying to pioneer new ideas, and this car certainly did that. In fact, the teardrop shape itself, which was so alien back then, is now widely used on so many cars, particularly EVs going for a maximum aerodynamic design, the same basic shape of the DS 70 years ago. But the other big idea that this car was famous for was its hydro-pneumatic suspension. I'm not going to get into all of the technical details, but I will say this was a hydraulic suspension system that allowed the driver driver of the car to set the suspension height using this little lever in the footwell. And you can see on this lever, there are several different notches, and that corresponded to the various heights of the car. And you can see here, the car is rising up as I am adjusting the lever and changing the ride height of the car. Now, there were several benefits of the hydropneumatic suspension. One, the most obvious, was you could raise the car all the way up, which was beneficial if you lived on country roads, dirt roads, rutted trails, which is pretty common in France in the 1950s. Raise it up and you could clear obstacles and get to your farmhouse. The suspension system also allowed the car to be self-leveling, which meant if you put a bunch of people or stuff inside the car, heavy things weighing it down, it wouldn't actually sag. The car would come back to a regular ride height to make driving easier. And then there was the comfort factor. Roads in post-war France were pretty rough, and this suspension system allowed for a lot of suspension travel and a more comfortable ride than normal suspension. And you can see when the car is fully in the up position, it's almost amazing just how much it has climbed compared to the sort of standard normal ride height. You're talking about a massive height increase, which again, pretty common today in cars with air suspension to gain more ground clearance. You can also drop the suspension basically all the way, putting the body almost on the ground. I guess you would do this if you wanted to make it easier to get inside the car so you didn't have to step in. You could lower it all the way and just sort of slide in for the elderly or if you're carrying larger or heavier items. All of this controlled with an adjustable switch in the driver's footwell. By the way, one amazing quirk about the hydropneumatic suspension, this car didn't require a jack to change a tire if you got a flat. Instead, you would just raise the suspension to its highest setting, and then there was a little stand you would stick under the car next to the affected flat tire to kind of keep it in place, and you just pull the tire off the car and then put on the new non-flat tire without using a jack at all, which is a pretty nifty trick. And of course, there's a lot more. How about the rear sunshade, which isn't a typical like mesh cloth sunshade like in most cars. Instead, it's window blinds. Venetian blinds could rise up the back of the car and provide shade to rear passengers as a sunshade. Instead of your typical sunshade, you had blinds from a living room back here. That's what they decided to do. Like I said, quirky. And of course, you can also see another major quirk in back, the turn signals, which are not mounted on the bumper like every other car. Instead, they're up on the sides of the rear window near the top, the roof line of the car, sort of at the edge of this long chrome teardrop panel that almost makes them look like rocket engine boosters. It's a very cool look and certainly a very odd one to stick the turn signals up here. And how about this panel, this aluminum panel next to the teardrop chrome housing for the turn signals? This panel is now commonly used by a lot of different vehicles. It's a design trick to make it look like the roof is floating, giving it an actual separation from the body, unpainted, to kind of make the roof seem like a totally different piece floating in the car. Nobody in the 1950s was doing this, but Citroen did, and now it's become adopted by so many other cars, and it's pretty crazy to see it here all the way back in the day. And by the way, speaking of the roof, here's another innovation. The roof in this car was made of fiberglass in order to lower the center of gravity. A usual metal roof is very heavy up at the top of the car. Fiberglass meant you had a lighter panel there, and the overall center of gravity came down. This was a pretty impressive innovation back when everyone was making cars of big, heavy steel. A fiberglass roof. And another major Citroen DS innovation, the brakes. This wasn't the very first car to have disc brakes. Other automakers had experimented with it, but the Citroen DS was the very first car to bring disc brakes to the mass market. The first real car built in any numbers with disc brakes. Think about that, because the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, the first supercar technologically advanced, was also being made in this era, and that had drum brakes, but the Citroen DS was here with disc brakes, a real innovator. Of course, in today's world, virtually all modern cars have made the switch to disc brakes, and drums are a thing of the past, and that's another item that started here. Something thing, though, that didn't quite start here was the mounting location of the brakes. They're inboard. If you look very closely, you can see the brakes are actually here, sort of sharing the engine bay with the engine itself and not actually mounted at the wheels. Some other cars use inboard brakes, but not many. And this was definitely an innovation that didn't really catch on. Speaking of the engine bay, by the way, there's a Citroen DS quirk for you accessing the engine bay. You have a little latch in the driver's footwell, you pull, and then it pops the hood. So you come around to the front, you open it, except it's not opening. And why is that? Did you not pull the latch all the way? It seems like only one latch opened and the other is stuck. Well, that's by design, because there's another latch over on the passenger side, and to access it, you pull another tab in the passenger footwell, and then you have unlatched the hood and you can come up to the front and open the engine compartment. You got to do two latches, one on the driver's side, one on the passenger side. Certainly quirky. Another thing that didn't really catch on. Now, one thing you'll notice in this engine compartment, the spare tire is located here, which by modern standards is very quirky. But back in this era, it was actually pretty common. Many cars had their spare tires sharing space with the engine, and in fact, a lot of cars were designed around that, having enough space for the spare tire and the engine bay so they could leave the cargo compartment free for actual cargo. And by the way, since we're talking about the front of the DS, we gotta talk about the headlights. One of the other great innovations of this car was that the headlights would swivel and turn as you turned the steering wheel in the direction that you were turning. Swiveling headlights. This didn't debut when the DS first came out. It came later in the late 1960s, but it was a big innovation. Again, the very first mass market car to have this feature. And the market responded by kind of laughing at the DS, actually. Other cars didn't adopt this feature, and even Citroen dropped it on later models, but it came roaring back decades later, and these days, pretty much every luxury car has headlights that sweep as you turn the wheel to illuminate the road ahead of you. Another innovation that was pioneered here for mass market cars. Pretty impressive. But anyway, next we move inside the DS for all the quirks and features in here. There's more to discuss under the hood, but I want to get to all the really weird stuff. So we start with the door handle. Just getting inside the car. It doesn't look weird until you go to actually use it, and the latch part kind of pushes up and disappears into the door handle, and then it unlatches, you climb inside. The interior door handle is also weird, but in a cool way. It's this chrome piece here, and to open the door, you put your thumb on this sort of lever at the end, you push, and then the door opens, and you just kind of keep pushing. It's actually a pretty cool and kind of quirky design. And there are many more quirky designs in here, but we gotta start with the steering wheel, which is the first and weirdest thing you notice when climbing inside. That's because it's a single spoke steering wheel that goes from the edge to the middle, and you don't actually have any other spokes around the rest of the wheel like you do in every other vehicle. This is completely bizarre, but Citroen thinks that it's functional. In their idea, you could use this single post to kind of grab on and make a bunch of turns of the wheel. You could do that easier than going hand over hand on the wheel rim or contending with other spokes in the center, and that's what they have done. Actually, I think the weirdest part of this steering wheel is that it is currently straight. This is the dead-on, completely straight position with the single spoke curved off to the side. To the edge. It doesn't make any sense at all, but that's what they've decided to do here. The single misaligned spoke steering wheel. And if that's not weird enough, how about the gear shift situation? It's mounted on the top of the steering column, and while the gear shifting is weird, the strangest part is that you use the shift lever to start the ignition. So you put the key in over on the left side of the steering column, and then you push the gear lever all the way to the left where it says engine start, and that starts the engine. The gear lever is also the ignition. And then the gear lever does other weird stuff, because this car has an automated manual transmission that you shift without a clutch pedal on the steering column. So you can see first gear is on the top, and so is reverse along the top, and then 2, 3, and 4 are down below, and neutral is in the middle. And when you're driving this car, you start by sticking it in first, and when it's ready, you shift into second. No clutch pedal, but you have to shift. It's not a fully automatic transmission, and then you go into third and fourth, etc. And when you're at a stoplight, you sit in neutral, which is sort of between the gears. So a manual transmission, but with no clutch pedal, that you shift on the steering column with a shifter that is also the ignition. Didn't I say quirky? And in fact, to me, this strikes me as a little needlessly quirky, not really very innovative, because at the time this car came out, regular automatic transmissions already existed. Ones you just put in drive and you went. And so having this, it was a cool idea, an automated manual, but I think a lot of people who wanted something automated would have just preferred a traditional automatic, which is one of the reasons why this car wasn't a big sales success here in the United States. But anyway, on the subject of quirks, of course, there's more. Let's go on to the steering column stock, starting with this little one. You push it up or down for the turn signals, pretty standard, but you'll notice there's also a little diagram on here, one with a small circle and one with a larger triangle. Those are your two different horns. It's called a town and country horn, and one of them is very loud. You can hear it. And the other one is softer. You can hear it. And the thinking was you would use the softer horn in town to just sort of beep, hey, I'm coming through, bicyclist, I'm here, oh, the light turned green, you didn't notice. But when you were out in the country, you would use the larger, louder horn because you needed to project over longer distances. And so you had both options with your dual note town and country horn. Now, beyond that stock, the rest are actually pretty standard. There's one for windshield wipers, as you can see here. And over on the other side, you have a stock for the headlights. Pretty straightforward, actually. In this vicinity, though, on the subject of bizarre things, there is, of course, another one to mention, and that would be the stopping distance marker. Okay, inside the speedometer, you have a little rotating disc that would actually turn as your speed increased to let you know how long your stopping distance was, give you sort of a general idea based on your speed. So you can see my speed is rising, the stopping distance is changing to let you know how many feet it would be at this speed in order to get the car stopped, which is a crazy thing. Actually kind of a neat idea. I'm not sure how useful it is, how many people actually know how far something is in feet, but it was there letting you know actively your current stopping distance based on your speed. Now actually the gauges in this car are kind of cool. The speedometer, aside from the stopping distance marker, is pretty standard, and so is the tachometer. But over on the left, I really like the idea of a gauge devoted to all the warning lights. So it looks like the rest of the gauge cluster, this circle, but it includes your warning lights and also your turn signals. Now the big red light right in the middle, that was your stop light. And if something was going on with the car, it would turn on sort of like a modern day check engine light to let you know you should stop, pull over, and maybe do some work or take the car to a mechanic. Also in this vicinity, I kind of like the fuel gauge, which you can see is this vertical display here. Same with engine temperature, kind of a cool way to display that stuff back in an era where most automakers weren't really doing any cool experimentation with gauges. But anyway, there are still many more quirks in this interior to cover. How about the fact that the rear view mirror is mounted down here low, basically at the base of the windshield, and that was owing to the teardrop shape of the car. If you had mounted it high, the teardrop roof, you wouldn't really been able to see anything out of it. So mounting it low gives you full visibility out the back window. Another result of this car's sort of unusual design is the sun visors. Because the top of this car was sort of curved around, the sun visors couldn't be mounted straight, and so they are perpetually kind of at an angle. The driver's off to the left, the passenger's off to the right, and that meant some of your sun visor coverage just wasn't there, the price you pay for beautiful style. And how about the center switches? You go into the center stack here and you can see there is a switch that is marked G1, which is so nonsensical and cryptic to everybody that they had to actually add a second label to it next to the switch that says hazard lights, because G1 turns on your hazards. Now, next to G1, there is a button that has the sun on it that does not turn on the sun, which you might be forgiven for thinking in this bizarre, quirky car. Instead, that turns on the interior lights that are mounted in the back. You can see back there, they turn on with the push of that button. Also interesting here in the center control stack at the very bottom, I love this sort of abstract work of art that shows whether this lever is putting out cold air or warm air. You can see the warm is much larger than the cold, depending on the placement of the lever. They didn't really have to make it sort of angled like this. They could have done a much more traditional diagram, but they didn't. So you have sort of these two esoteric shapes, almost looks like art at the base of your center control stack. And how about the footwell where you can see the pedals? The parking brake has the Citroen logo on it. The regular brake is just a circle in the floor. Are you understanding how quirky this car is yet? And next we move on to the back seat in the Citroen DS, which is shockingly roomy. I say shockingly, that might be a surprise for you because I said this is a full-size, larger sedan. I'm not surprised that I have good room for my legs, my knees. I'm surprised I have room for my head given the car's teardrop shape. The sort of tapering roofline you would think would rob headroom from rear seat passengers, but actually the tapering roofline is kind of a trick. It looks like a teardrop shape when you look at it from the side, but if you look from behind, you can see the teardrop actually makes sort of an arch in the back, and that's where the real roof inside the car is, the ceiling, and that allows for better rear seat headroom while still maintaining the teardrop shape on the side of the car. It's a pretty neat visual and design trick. Now, other than that stuff, like all cars from the 50s, 60s, 70s, the back seat is nothing special. You basically just have a bench back here. You're lucky to have seat belts, and you do have an ashtray mounted on the back of the front passenger seat because you couldn't have a car in France in this era and not have the ability to smoke cigarettes. And it was the same deal with the trunk. You open the trunk back here, lift it up, and again, just like the back seat, nothing really quirky or unusual in back. You had pretty good trunk space, wasn't anything weird or odd or surprising back here. Also true of the fuel door, which you can see mounted on the passenger side next to the trunk. You just flip it open, you put in fuel. Nothing too weird in this vicinity. Citroen decided back here they were done quirking it up and they just wanted to make something that actually made some sense and was familiar to people. Although there actually are a couple of interesting quirks, sort of smaller ones in this area. One is that you can see mounted on the rear side of the car in this silver housing is a red reflector. That was a US market requirement and still is. All US market cars on the rear side have to have red reflectors. They didn't do that in France, so for the US market they just kind of stuck these ugly silver things on to comply with that regulation. Same thing up front where it has to be an orange reflector, and you can see they've also just sort of stuck on something in order to comply with US regs to sell this car in the States. Now the other interesting quirk back here is the car's name. It seems so simple. DS is just 2 letters, but there's actually a lot more to it than that. First off, you look on the trunk and you can see this is badged as DS21. Let's start with the quirk of DS, which isn't just 2 letters, it's actually a pun. In French, DS is pronounced as déesse, which is also the French word for goddess. And so you had these 2 letters, but it was also telling you that this car was a goddess, if you really felt that way about the design. The other interesting thing is the numbers, DS21. What's exactly going on there? That referred to the engine size. The DS never really had a big engine or a lot of power. The original cars were called DS19, referring to a 1.9 liter 4-cylinder made about 75 horsepower. Later, they came with the DS21. It's actually a 2.2 liter 4-cylinder, but it was 2175 cc, so they called it the 21. And then later, there was even a DS23 with a 2.3 liter 4-cylinder, and that was it. There was never a V6 or a V8, anything like that, and they never really got powerful. This car probably had about 105 horses, which is pretty average even for its day. The most powerful DS, which would have been a 23 with fuel injection that came later, this is carbureted, but some did have injection, and that car would have had about 140 horsepower, the real muscle car of the Citroen DS world. It's also worth pointing out that the design of this car, it wasn't just this 4-door sedan. This was the vast majority of Citroen DS models, but there was also a station wagon wagon version, which I think is actually one of the ugliest cars ever manufactured, because you took this beautiful teardrop shape from the normal car and you had to make it practical, and it almost looks like a second square boxy car has climbed on top of the teardrop shaped car and really ruined the design in an effort of practicality. Interestingly, there was also a convertible. This wasn't officially made by Citroen, but instead by a coach builder in the period. It only made about 1,300 convertible DS models, and these days they are prized cars that sell for a lot of money, sort of considered the ultimate iteration of the DS. And with all that stuff in mind, we should probably talk about what happened after the DS. So this car was a huge success. They sold more than 1.3 million DS models over a 20-year lifespan, and it was sold and produced all across the globe. This was a very successful, very popular car in its day, although not particularly popular in the States. The low horsepower was due to a French taxation system that penalized high horsepower cars, and so you were incentivized to keep power low. Here in the States, we had no such taxation system. In the 50s and 60s, cars had big, old school, big block V8s that made a lot of power, and this little weird, quirky French thing just didn't make sense for a lot of people, and so not a lot of people bought them. But globally, they had a lot more of an impact. After the DS finally got to the end of the production run, Citroen replaced it with basically two cars. There was a sporty two-door replacement. It was a four-seat Grand Tourer called the SM, which included a lot of the DS's quirks, just more modernized. And then there was the sort of more common practical version, the Citroen CX, which had a similar look, but sort of brought to a more modern mid-70s, 80s design language, and it still kept some of the quirks, including the weird suspension. Amazingly, the CX went on sale until 1991. So in this large sedan segment, Citroen only had two different models from 1955 to 1991, which really gives you an idea of how advanced these cars were in terms of technology and in terms of design. They still looked fresh. But I am especially curious what it's like on the road. I have never driven a Citroen DS, so today I'm going to get behind the wheel and find out. All right, driving the Citroen DS. One of the all-time weirdest, quirkiest, most interesting, most talked about, most iconic cars. I have never driven one of these cars until right now. I have always wanted to, and I have never done it, and here I go, shifting gears with a clutchless manual on the column. I am always amazed with cars from this era. This isn't that old. The 70s wasn't that long ago. And I'm always amazed at the differences in quality and in what we put up with. You know, what we put up with back then, not that long ago. Shifting gears on the column and the carbureted car, it's so slow, it's so underpowered. It is an interesting driving experience, that much is for sure. Shifting on the column and sitting here. Although to me, the most interesting part of this car is just how quirky and weird it is. The design, some of the design elements. It's less about sort of the driving experience, which is probably among the less quirky parts, although it is still very unusual, obviously, with this single-post steering wheel and the hydropneumatic suspension, which, by the way, delivers as advertised. I am astonished with the suspension, just how smooth the ride is. And, you know, that's interesting because that was not the primary selling point. A lot of people think the primary selling point of the ride, of the suspension, was that the ride was better, but really it was that you could raise or lower the ride height. I will say the drawback of the suspension is that it means that the car has a lot more body roll than you would probably expect if we did not have such a suspension, because there is so much give. It really soaks up the bumps, but just like in a traditional suspension, that comes with the big drawback of not cornering particularly sharp. The shifting on the column, which was fairly common in its day, is quite a clunky experience, I will say. Overall, though, the car it's pretty nice and comfortable and reasonable to use, as long as you're willing to sort of put up with this stuff from the old days. Oh, man, the column shifting, you have to really know what you're doing. I just went for neutral and got first. The car handles that kind of stuff, but it's clunky. God, it's just crazy. driving this car, the transmission, everything would be a lot easier if this car just had a normal transmission. I think a big part of the problem is that the engine starter on the gear lever, combined with neutral sort of being in the middle of first and second, but not in the middle of second, third, and fourth, it definitely requires a little bit of effort to figure out how it all works. But it drives like an older car, and actually a pretty competent one in terms of sort of the way it feels on the road, and sort of its stability and its kind of comfort, if you will. This transmission is definitely the weak point in my mind of using this car. The gear changes are supposed to be nice and easy, but in practice they're really not. And I find that the car actually stalls occasionally when you're going down to a stop and you go into neutral and it's like, oh, you have to engage a clutch. Well, there isn't a clutch. Do you French? God, what an interesting and bizarre situation this vehicle is. But again, once you get going and when you're actually moving, it actually feels pretty smooth. You just have to control for the fact that the ride is really soft and floaty, and the steering is therefore a little vague because of the suspension. You just have to be careful with all that stuff. But overall, this is an interesting car. It is a fun and weird car. And I'm thrilled that I've had the chance to drive it. I have always wanted to, and it has definitely given me a new appreciation for what crazy and quirky and weird could be. And so that's the Citroen DS. Weird? Yes. Weird and French? Yes. Weird and French and quirky and bizarre? Yes, it's all of those things. But it's also legitimately innovative, pioneering some amazing features and design details, and it's undeniably cool. And especially cool for someone who loves quirks and features. And you can buy this DS on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the quirkiest car a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 42 out of 100, which puts the DS here against some sort of relevant cars, mainly some other Citroen models, plus a Rolls-Royce from this era. The DS does well, though by modern standards it loses a bit of its charm. I've never found the car quite as beautiful as so many others. Innovative, yes, but beautiful isn't the term I'd use. It's also not exactly engaging or exciting to drive. Of course, that wasn't the point, so it's fine, but it does take a hit there in the Doug score. To me, the real charm of the DS is in all of its innovations, and it certainly won me over throughout filming. By the end, I really was impressed with this weird French car and all the cool things it pioneered.